We have been hearing so much about the Reserve Bank, and they're coming under fire when it comes to house prices. But the Reserve Bank is continuously keeping a close eye on heavily indebted dairy farms at the moment, as a proportion of loans targeted at-risk default remains stubbornly high. Great adjective. In its twice yearly health check of the financial system, the central bank has repeatedly warned that the trading banks to closely monitor the quality of their lending to horticulture, which is currently growing at an annual rate of 15%. They're next in line. We welcome Scott Wishart back to Sarah's Country, Managing Director of NZAB. Scott, why do you think the banks have long-standing concerns with the level of heavily indebted dairy farms in the current climate, where we're heard about funding for lending and getting it out to productive sectors?
Yeah, hi Sarah. Look, thanks for the opportunity to come back on. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think fundamentally, just to take a step back, like the dairy farming profitability is some of the highest I think we've seen in recent years. We were having a look at some dairy NZAB data the other day, and the interest covers in the sector, which measure the viability of businesses, are at the highest levels we've seen since the early 2000s, which is pre the first milk powder boom. So from that perspective, things are going really well. We're seeing dairy debt get repaid at quite a rate of knots. Dairy debt over the last 18 months has reduced from 69% of total agriculture debt to 64%. So, that's continuing to shrink. And actually we're seeing, agri as a percentage of all loans for the banks reduced from an average of 14.5 down to 13. So what that really says is dairy is actually reducing as a component of risk for the banks. And against that, I suppose we're seeing home loans, or the non-productive sector, now at between 60 and 65% of the bank's makeup. So it's really interesting. I suppose that my take on it is that those farms that were in real trouble after the dairy downturn are still in real trouble. I think we're still seeing some situations that are really challenging to work our way through. And they're now becoming a higher proportion of the dairy book. And so I think that makes those metrics stand out a little bit. But, we are seeing, by and large, dairy farmers are reducing debt really quickly.
And this financial stability report of the Reserve Bank shows 3% of dairy farms are in default for 90 days or more. So this concern seems absurd.
Yeah, look, I mean, and I guess the default 90 days, it can mean a lot of things, but, fundamentally there are some dairy farms out there that are still really struggling to determine what to do. And it's still a really challenging market because, the stats I just read to you demonstrate that capital is leaving the agricultural sector still at a rapid rate of knots. And, what we need in order to solve some of these problems is the confidence to invest back into the sector, which will allow us to help support farmers to solve some of these problems. Put a lid on put a floor rather on some of the prices we're seeing for land assets, and encourage farmers to invest not only in their own farms to meet environmental and performance gains, but also to help fix some of these issues that are still hanging around.
But at the same time, overnight we've seen a lift in the GDT and whole milk powder up 5%. And we've had the likes of Conrad from Property Brokers on Sarah's Country in the past talking about the fact that the economics stack up. So is it just really a perception thing at the moment?
Yeah, totally. There's the yields from dairy farming, have never been stronger in my observation. It really just comes down to what position farmers are in below the line, so how they can use their cash. And there's still just a number of farmers that have to use all of their cash from earnings to repay debt because of the leverage that they have. But operationally, the farms are performing very, very strongly. So I think what we see from here, and I was reading a report this morning from Westpac that suggested payouts of $7 for the next couple of years. It's just a great opportunity to continue to reduce debt. those farmers that are reducing debt, if they have a banking sector that is confident enough to reinvest capital in behind those farmers, then we will start to see opportunities, and we will start to see the market start to move forward. And that, I think, is the only way to solve some of these really deep-seated hard issues that are sticking around for the banks. Although, we're not in the situation we were in a couple of years ago, where we were still trying to get our hands around what those problems were. I think everybody knows now, what's working and what isn't working. And I think everybody's faced their reality. There's been a few farms that maybe were on the cusp and they've revalued or reassessed the viability of those businesses. So, I think that's probably what's showing up in some of those bank stats as well, is just that there's a lot more reality being brought to the table.
It's not being brought to the table, though, in terms of dairy farms hitting the market. We're not seeing a flood of dairy listings, though.
No, we're not. And I think fundamentally it's because everybody is conscious that there just isn't the liquidity to actually take those farms through to sale. I think, in the early days it was a strategy of a lot of farmers after the dairy downturn to look at listing farms, because, it kind of ticked a box for the bank to say, well, we're going to do something here. But there were hundreds of farms on the market with no buyers. And I think what that meant is that, as much as it was something to consider, for a lot of farmers it wasn't actually a real strategy, and the real strategy was to reposition their businesses and their operational models in order to try and find a way to get through until we see some confidence return. And so we've seen a lot of that.
Yeah, and Scott, from your previous rural banking career, what is the strategy from the bank to say, look, mortgagee is not an option, we need to wrap around support around this farmer and work our way through this? Because effectively an indebted farmer is a dairy farm owned by the bank, so they've got a huge invested interest in seeing it come out the other side. How do they go about that rather than just beating them with a stick?
It really is an individual process. I think the first thing the bank's looking for is the confidence in the individuals. So where the bank has trust and confidence in the people who are on those farms, they're usually prepared to support a farmer-led strategy to solve the problem. You tend to see forced sales and other things primarily occur when either that trust is broken down or when those strategies have failed. I suspect that things like the Rural Debt Mediation Act have slowed down the processes in a lot of cases. There's now a few more steps in the middle. It's causing both farmers and bankers to pause and reflect on how they're engaging with each other through some of these tricky situations. And so, I think that's been positive. I think it's, rather than a rush for a bank to solve a problem for themselves or a rush for a farmer to pretend there isn't a problem, I think it's brought a good process into the middle.
What about farmers taking a more cautious approach to investment when it's actually needed because of the bank's appetite to rural risk?
Yes, it's still an issue, something we see every day. If you don't have your own strategy, you will adopt others' strategies, and that is absolutely what we see. I mean, banks, as we know, they all have long-term or status quo metrics that they use to assess viability. If you don't have your own view of the market, the bank will use theirs. And, I still see that default position where the banks are saying, debt repayment over 20 years, thanks, is a great place to start. But obviously there's a lot of capital that needs to be invested in environmental compliance and in, changes to operational models to support that in a lot of cases. So we are going to need to see money reinvested back in these farms. And yeah, we are continuously concerned about the lack of confidence to do that.
It's interesting because to me from the outside, it seems like it's a top-down direction of horticulture's hot, dairy's not, this is where you need to spend your money. And horticulture lending, led by the kiwi fruit industry, is growing at an annual rate of 15%. This latest financial stability report says. Can horticulture end up in the same scenario as dairy?
Oh, any sector can, Sarah, and I think that's, that is one of the things that you do have to be very careful of, is making investment decisions off the back of bank risk appetite settings. You're right, it's a way of rebalancing a portfolio from a bank's perspective. Look, the fundamentals of the horticulture sector are really strong, so I'm not surprised that there's a lot of appetite to invest there. But I think that those that are investing in that sector, should and often do adopt the same processes that we run in dairy and sheep and beef, which is just be really clear about what your strategy is and how you're going to make your returns and how you're going to manage your risk. But make sure that you actually own and control that rather than just relying on the bank to have the right view of the sector. As
always, Scott Wishart, Managing Director of NZAB, bringing light to where the appetite is for our banks and how to navigate them. Of course, they have some fantastic reports on nzab.co.nz to be able to learn and understand what you need to do to get into a better position if you need to. Thank you so much for joining Ceres Country. For more on this story, check out this week's Farmers Weekly on Nigel Sterling's story titled Dairy Debt Default Risk Remains High.
This is Ceres Country.